Okay, can you see and hear that?
I see and hear it just
Yes.
fine.
Very good, thank you. Okay, so I'm Bill Hanna. About 3 weeks ago, I passed the 10th anniversary of my first occultation campaign, something run by Mark Buey from Sweary, came to Australia when I was living there. But 6 years ago, I retired, moved back to the US, and found that I was going to have trouble here. So mostly because of the weather. So today I'm going to talk about why I wanted a remote telescope, how I chose the site, what equipment I got, what I'm up to now, and what I intend to do in the future. So here I'm holding the most important piece of accessory for occultation observing in Northwest Montana. When it's clear here, it's not dark, and when it's dark, it's not clear. It's interesting that I can often see mountains in the distance that are 35 miles away, but I can't see anything overhead. So part of the reason was to avoid freezing to death or being eaten by a bear or a mountain lion. So although I have equipment here, what I found was that I just couldn't, because of the weather, I just couldn't do much of anything. So I decided if I was going to do this, continue observing at all, I needed to do something somewhere else without moving. So I looked all over the world for places that host telescopes, but not a single one of them had a telescope for rent that you could use to support our occultation timing events. So I figured I'd have to basically set up my own. I lived in Australia for many years, so I also decided I wanted to be east of my instrument so I wouldn't be up all night. So I looked at 4 sites in Australia. There are others, but there's one up at Siding Spring, which is the big observatory complex in Australia. There's one in Coonabarabran, which is basically just outside of Siding Spring. Martin Pugh Astrophotography near Yass, which is a bit north of Canberra, and Riverland Dingo near Marook, which is on the Murray River in southeast South Australia. There were pluses and minuses for every one of them. I ended up choosing Martin Pugh simply because he's a noted astrophotographer. He helped a lot with the setup. So I was very happy with the choice I made. So I started out, when I retired, I knew that I was interested in a great many things, but rather than do a bunch of things kind of, I decided to go hard on to a single one of them, and I chose the occultation equipment, or occultation observing. So the equipment I chose, I wanted to kind of make a future-proof system that I wouldn't probably have to upgrade later. So I have a 20-inch plane wave corrected Dell-Kirkham with a focal reducer to f4.5, which gives the QHY camera a field of view of roughly 17 by 11 arc minutes. I wanted to be able to rotate the field primarily for the PHEMU, the Jupiter Moon mutual events. I'll talk about that in a minute. And then, of course, standard fans and heaters to worry about dew and things. I got a Paramount ME2 mount from Software Bisque. I am extremely pleased with that. It wasn't cheap, but it really, there's nothing quite like the beauty of typing in the coordinates and having the star in the center of the field of view every time. To me, that's worth a lot without having to go up and set up the telescope and align it every night. The QHY 174M GPS camera, which is used extensively by Sweary and some other people, filter wheel for a number of things, and then more importantly, CompuLab IPC2 ruggedized computer, a fanless computer that rides on the telescope itself with a 500 gigabyte solid state drive. So I looked into the price of all these things, both in the US and in Australia. And although it would have been, I won't say considerably less expensive, but it would have been less expensive if I purchased it all here and then shipped it to Australia. But what that would mean is I had to worry about all these things. Now, we don't have sales tax in Montana, but I probably would have purchased the equipment in California, and you know how crazy that can be. I didn't want to worry about shipping. I didn't want to worry about all the customs nonsense. I'd lived overseas. I knew what that can mean. So I just said, well, it's better to just spend the money in Australia and let, so the binocular and telescope shop, Bentel in Glebe, New South Wales, which is a kind of inner western suburb of Sydney. And I'd worked with Don there for many years, even when they were back on York Street in downtown Sydney. And Don works very closely with many of the observatories in Australia, and especially with Martin's. So that was the right, the money was, to remove the hassle was worth the price to my feeling. Now, what I have done since I purchased it, there have been a few changes. One of the other users in Martin's observatory wanted a focuser rotator, and he had what you might call the standard Hedrick focuser from PlaneWave. So we agreed to do a swap. And so what we did is we set up my camera, rotated, I think it's around 17 degrees or so that the plane of the Jupiter moons is more or less running along the diagonal of the camera in its current configuration. Now, when the PHMU 21 campaign is over at the end of the year, I'll rotate it back to having north be up. And then for the campaign, I wanted specifically to use a methane filter, which is very useful for, in effect, darkening the disk of Jupiter when the moons are very close. But the methane filter is very tall as filters go. And I also have an R-band precision filter, also tall, and these simply wouldn't fit in the QHY filter wheel. So I moved over to a Starlight Express filter wheel, which can accommodate those larger filters. And of course, like any project, there's all the niggling little extra bits, a lot of counterweights, and I wasn't going to pay money to ship a hunk of metal across the Pacific, so I had some counterweights manufactured locally. A web power switch, which controls it turns on the power supplies, one of which is nominally 12 volts. I run it a little over 13 actually, into a distribution box. The GPS antenna that came with the camera, it was difficult to locate it in a place that was very useful or reliable, I should say. And as it turned out, Christo Pavlov from Occult Watcher fame had an extra high sensitivity antenna, which he gave me. And I thank you, Risto, if you're watching again for that. Numerous mounting plates. I had to get precise parts to make an adapter for the filter wheel to the focal reducer. And of course, some of the software requires a software license. I highly recommend, if you use SharpCap, to get the SharpCap Pro license. It's not terribly expensive. So here's how it all connects together. Basically, everything is on the telescope, mounted on the telescope, except for the power supplies, which are external, and the fixed GPS antenna, which is mounted on the wall. But I have the Fanless PC controls the focuser, controls the fans and heaters. The power is distributed by the Powerbox from the 12 volts to these other units, and the camera talks via USB 3, talks to the PC talks to the mount USB 2, and then the GPS antenna is separate, and the PC talks via Wi-Fi basically to Martin's local router. And so here's a picture of the bit. So here's the PC and the external hard drive, camera, filter wheel, the power distribution unit, the heater controller. A little bit close-up view of those, of the heater controller and the power unit, and a bigger one of, again, the focuser rotator and the filter wheel are different, but the overall configuration remains the same. So on a typical day, when I'm going to do something, I fire up my home PC, and I got an Asus gaming laptop, not because I am a gamer, but it has the horsepower to drive all these things remotely easily. I have approximately 120 megabits per second internet to my house here. So then I get my system going. I log into Martin's system through a VPN, turn on the 12 volt and 48 volts power supplies to the telescope and the mount, and log out of that, but then log in to the computer, which then basically controls everything else. And so I get the mount going, unpark the telescope, type in the desired coordinates, slew there, launch SharpCap and initialize the camera, and then begin capturing data. On a good day, from the start to data capture can be as little as 15 minutes. But I typically, for the purpose of planning, I allow myself an additional 20 minutes at least, so that if there is a problem, and there are occasionally network problems, and very occasionally there's a hardware problem where I have to call Martin in the middle of the night and get him to go out and plug in a loose connector or something. So then when I'm done, standard using Tangra, or starting to use PyMovie a bit more now. And then I have the ability to transfer the files back to my computers here, where I then do my reporting. But the Tangra or PyMovie output files are all I send back. I don't typically send the raw fits frames back here, although I have on occasion for testing purposes. And then when I'm done, I basically just work this in reverse order. Why is it not? There we go. So when I log onto the PC through the VNC viewer, I get a remote screen, and it's set up so that the power distribution and the mount control apps launch automatically. So they just sort of come up when I log in. And again, the VNC viewer allows the file transfers. The one problem I have, and it's a continuing problem, and that there really is no solution, is that the slider controls on SharpCap really don't respond well with the latency of the thing. So it's very disturbing, is the kindest word I can use. I do sometimes speak to the computer. And something I've found, that the HDMI display emulator dummy plug makes the PC think that there's a screen physically connected to the computer. My understanding is that's necessary for some machines, but not for others. It's certainly necessary for mine. And on Martin's homepage, there's a fair bit of useful information, so that when rarely when I have to get up in the middle of my night, usually not too late, maybe 3 or 4 in the morning, I can immediately get a sense of what the weather is like in Yass. the Boltwood sensor, which is used to give a measure of the cloud, the rain, and the wind. In theory, also humidity, but the humidity sensor on that is not particularly reliable. And he has an all-sky camera, webcam to see the status of the 7 telescopes that are in the observatory. And then the weather status console, which, I mean, I can tell if the roof is open or closed by looking at the observatory webcam, but what the status console does is give me the reason why the roof is closed if it's not otherwise obvious. And among the reasons I probably, knowing what I know now, would have chosen a different hosting site is that I'm at the mercy of his responsibility to all of the equipment in the observatory. And as you know, most of the other people are doing imaging, and I just am doing occultation observing primarily. I do some other stuff, but what I can live within clouds. I can live with a number of conditions that the imagers really can't. And so it's a semi-constant battle between me and Martin as to whether or not the roof should be closed at any given time. So I've been running this for just over 3 years now, and here are my statistics. So in the 3 years, this is through Thursday, and I've had 6 more no-obs due to rain in the last 2 days. Over 1,200 events that I've scheduled in Occult Watcher, which led to 532 reports, of which not quite a quarter were positive, but a serious number of weather problems there. Really over half of my planned observations have been weather affected. I'm not terribly pleased with that, but the weather is what it is. Very few technical issues in the big picture, but I actually had more problems that were me rather than the weather or the technical things. I won't go into the details of that. And so here's the number of collections per month that I've had since I started. And what's of particular note here is that in February, when Occult 4 incorporated the Gaia 16 data, I'm going after dimmer events somewhere. And so my monthly collections are now, well, for the month of June, I averaged more than 4 per day for the month. And now this is based on the evidence of the reports that I have submitted. So this is sort of the ultimate, absolutely best case statistics for my system, where, in other words, I can't exceed this frame rate for a given star magnitude at all and have anything that is a decent signal to noise ratio. But if the sky is clear and there's no moon and the star is well above the horizon, I can do 5 frames per second at mag 15 or 60 frames per second at about mag 12.6 or so. And I find that gives me an opportunity to do a great many events. In fact, I've started getting a little braver and going for sub-second, even sub-half-second events with some success, actually, which is a good thing. So what am I going to do going forward? So I've started using the SharpCap scripting language, very initial use of that, but I intend to use more of it. I did do what I had to do to get an MPC observatory code, and I do, when I'm not doing occultations, which is obviously not all the time, I do some astrometry, currently mostly of targets to support the Lucy mission that'll be launched later this year by Swery and those other people, and also whatever else the Minor Planet Center wants information on. And I've been participating in the Jupiter Moon Mutual event campaign, and compared to the beautiful geometry I had from Alice Springs in 2015. The 2021 campaign has been rather disappointing, but I have made 11 observations for that to date. And then given the, especially the Gaia 16 and the new capabilities of Occult version 4, I'm putting a lot of my personal predictions for the dimmer, shorter events onto Occult Watcher so that other observers in the general area can participate in my campaigns as well. And so here's a script that it's very crude, but it does work. So if you're using SharpCap and you want to set the thing up so that you can get it going and then walk away or go back to bed in my case, this will start a capture of this many frames after this many seconds from the time you launch the script. It's not pretty, and there's absolutely no user feedback. It works so well for me that I don't feel a compulsion to make it any better, although I probably really should. Something I would note for anyone who wants to use this is this space right here between the equal sign and the number of frames is very important. If you put the number right against the equal sign, the script basically ignores the number and it will just continue to capture until you stop it yourself. And that's not always necessarily a good thing if you've gone back to bed and you wake up and you find that you've got 60 gigabytes of your hard drive or your solid state drive used up. So that's all I have. Do you have any questions?
Hi, Bill. Do you have a picture of the telescope?
You know, I thought I did.
Yeah, I think we saw one with the equipment attached to it.
Yeah, let me go back. Here we go. So,
Sorry, I was moving a light and missed that.
okay, no problem. Yeah, I elected to put the sort of shade on there to reduce problems with the scattered moonlight and other lights from within the observatory. Although the price I pay for that is I'm a little bit more sensitive to wind than I would otherwise like. But the beauty is that PyMovie can kind of help with that. So that's not the worst thing.
Bill, as I understand it, you started with occultations and then started with astrometry. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes. Mark Buey had come to Australia to do an occultation of Hydra, one of the then newly discovered moons of Pluto, and along with Frédéric Vacher from Paris Observatory. And the Astronomical Society of Alice Springs, we'd go out and we'd look at stuff, but we sort of thought like maybe we ought to be like doing something. And so this was an opportunity to do something. And of the members of the society, I was the only one that really got ignited by this. So I did a couple hundred when I was still in Australia before I retired and returned with a 14-inch Meade. I had a kind of a dry period once I moved to Montana for a couple of years. But in a way, the HOA, Homeowners Association, saved me from building my own observatory here. It would have not been terribly useful because the sky is just not very clear.
What would you say the learning curve is for astronomy or astrometry especially now that you've already ramped up on occultations?
Obviously, start with brighter. There's actually, if you go onto the Minor Planet Center site, they have a lot of good learning materials. And so I'd say go read through that and establishing a observatory code for a fixed observatory involves a fair amount of work, and they want to make sure that you know what you're doing. So
Yeah.
they ask you to take measurements on things that are extremely well known so that they can
Right.
compare your accuracy to that. And once you've passed that test, then you're kind of free to submit pretty much anything you want.
Nice. I'm jealous of the Paramount.
Bill,
uh,
Peter Saravolo asks whether you've considered using the Primulus computer. He says we use it and like it. Evidently, that's something that would be helpful for some astronomers.
I must admit I've not heard of it. I'm very happy with the CompuLab IPC2. At this point, I think even if that were better, the idea of changing to it, there would have to be an astonishingly compelling reason to do so. And maybe there is. I'll have a look into that. Okay, any other questions?
What does the Jupiter Mutual Events program, what kind of data is being collected?
Okay, approximately every 6 years, twice per Jupiter orbit, the plane of the Galilean moons of Jupiter appears edge on to us. And so the moons both occult and eclipse each other for about a year, roughly a year at various times. And although we do have the Juno spacecraft at Jupiter now, by doing the ground measurements of the interaction of the moons, it greatly increases the ability of the IMCCE, basically it's the European people who work out the orbit solutions, in particular of the moons. It gives them enough information to improve the orbit predictions for the next, well, for the future, and certainly until the next 6-year campaign comes up. And the good thing about them is they're very easy to observe because the moons are, around magnitude 5, so they're very bright. You can make the collection with very, very small telescopes, and their timing requirements are not nearly as severe as what we do for the asteroid occultations. It's not like there's no requirement, but they're somewhat less severe. So it's really quite a useful and interesting, easy thing to do, even for people with small instruments.
The data collection requirements basically the same as for asteroid occultations?
Yes. But the thing to note is that some of the mutual events can last 30 minutes, 45 minutes. So for cameras that record individual frames, you end up with not too big of a data set. But if you're running a video camera for 45 minutes, you have quite a lot of data, or just physically large amount of data to get through for the analysis.
Can I come in with just a couple of comments? You might think that the orbits of the Galilean satellites are well established, given the various space probes that have been around Jupiter. The particular interest that Paris Observatory has relates to the long-term changes in the orbit. And the spacecraft missions have only covered Jupiter accurately for about a decade, I guess. But so the spacecraft measurements didn't give the type of accuracy you might get over many decades. So the Jupiter mutual events allow for measurement of the long-term changes in the orbit of the planets, of the satellites. And this gives more information about the internal structure of Jupiter itself, which is the great interest of it. Now, I'll try to share a screen which shows one of the light curves I've got. We'll see how I go. Yeah. There. Is that showing up?
Yes.
So you can see here, that's a comparison satellite, and this is an event of, it was an eclipse by one satellite. Typically, the events last for 5 minutes or so, but they can last for an hour, and they can be complex. The first one I did this season was a eclipse of one satellite by another satellite, which was also being eclipsed at the same time. And the light curve reduction of that was anything but trivial. Yeah.
Okay. Well, Bill Hanna, I want to thank you for your presentation. That was really very interesting and probably helped motivate some people who've long been considering a similar setup someplace, you know. So thanks for all that.